can hear, yeah? No, no, no. Okay. I'll stick it in my mouth more or less. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming this afternoon to a very, very special occasion. Now, I shouldn't need to introduce our speaker for today. I hear that his classmates are here and so on. But, well, anyone interested in international relations would know of him or have read some of his work. But for the few of you who don't know him, let me say a few words about him. First of all, he's a distinguished adjunct researcher with Penang Institute, as has been so for many years, ever since I came back more or less 10 years ago. But that's not what he's famous for. He has had an illustrious career and is presently the Li Ka-shing Professor of Political Science at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS. Before that, he was Professor of International Relations and a Professorial Fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford University. And of course, he's from Penang, BFS student, that's important to note. Okay. Well, Prof received his PhD from Harvard University way back in '87. And his work was awarded Harvard's Sumner Prize for the best dissertation on war and peace the following year. The book based on his dissertation was published in 1992 called Analogies at War, Korea, Munich, Dien Bien Phu, and the Vietnam Decisions of 1965. And that book was the co-winner of the American Political Science Association's Political Psychology Book Award. You notice why I had to have something to read from. There are many awards that I wouldn't be able to remember. Right? Now, his research interests today include United States foreign policy, international relations in the Asia-Pacific, and cognitive approaches to international relations. Recent publications include the American Tributary System, I remember reading that a while ago, the Chinese Journal of International Politics, that's where it was published, and the United States Response to China's Rise in the International Security, published 10 years ago. You see why he is hot, quote unquote, at the moment, as commentator, teacher, and researcher, when the geopolitical condition in the world is changing so dramatically. He's currently working on 2 long-term projects, so this might be of interest to students here. International Politics, the Rules of the Game, and the American Tributary System. So please join me in welcoming Professor Khong Yuen Foong to Penang Institute and welcome him home to Penang. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ki Beng, for that very generous introduction. Can you hear me at the back if I don't use the mic? Yes. So I can shout a bit, huh? Okay, all right. I'm actually touched and gratified to see so many relatives, friends, well-wishers, and I hope a few critics, here this afternoon. My talk draws from a project that Joseph Liao and I started back in 2020. Maybe I'll just sit down while I'm speaking, called The Anatomy of Choice, Southeast Asia Between the Superpowers. The project was supported by the Singapore Social Science Research Council grant, which among other things allowed us to assemble a group of younger scholars of the international relations of Southeast Asia to tackle one key question. How are the Southeast Asian states aligning themselves vis-a-vis the US and China as the geopolitical rivalry between the 2 superpowers become more intense? And as we came closer to our answer, we began traveling all over the world to share our findings. And I'm especially thrilled to have the opportunity today to present our findings to a home audience in my hometown, right, courtesy of the Penang Institute. So, living in Southeast Asia, you, like me, might have sensed a certain strategic unease among the region's leaders in the last decade or so, an unease that I believe is widely shared beyond Southeast Asia, in Europe, Africa, elsewhere. In Southeast Asia, this feeling is that we are sandwiched between 2 superpowers, the US and China, engaged in what Joe Biden called extreme competition, right? And this discomfort on the part of many of our leaders in the region is best seen in this not wanting to choose talk by Lee Hsien Loong, Scott Morrison, Anwar Ibrahim, as you see in the slide. Now, Scott Morrison, you may also say, probably spoke too soon, because in 2020 he had to do an about face, and he chose decisively to align with the US after he said that you need an international inquiry on the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, which evoked a neuralgic reaction from China, resulting in trade sanctions. And Australia very quickly, under Scott Morrison, went back to its traditional alignment with the US. Right? Not that it was ever in doubt. So I think there are 4 interesting questions we can ask about this strategic unease or dilemma. First, what's driving the rivalry? Sorry, what is driving the discourse of not wanting to choose? Second, whatever the ASEAN countries say about not wanting to choose, you, like me, are probably curious about who is where today in terms of their leanings or alignments, vis-a-vis the 2 superpowers. Thirdly, what explains their alignment choices? And finally, what are the implications? So as I mentioned earlier, to answer these questions, we invited 10 younger experts on Southeast Asia's international relations to write on each of the ASEAN countries. We also worked with a smaller and separate team of researchers to create an alignment index to track the movements of the ASEAN countries. By alignment, we mean structured collaboration between states on issues of mutual interest. So on the first question, why all this talk about not wanting to choose? I think the straightforward answer is that there is palpable US and Chinese pressure on the uncommitted in Southeast Asia to take sides. And the reason why the superpowers are doing this is because they are engaged in a titanic struggle for hegemony, for being the leader in Asia. Now, what do I mean by that? This quote by anonymous US intelligence officials back in 2017 is rather telling. So they let on that the Chinese leaders see the US-led world, US-led order as constraining China's rise, and are attempting, to reshape the world order to better suit Chinese preferences and growing clout. For me, this is a rather perceptive take on China's strategic ambitions, and for the student of international relations, quite natural. Any power with China's might, size, scale, talent will want to change things to suit its clout, to suit its preferences when it has the clout to do so. So let's ask, how do things look when it comes to China's clout? According to the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index, the distribution of power in Asia looks something like this. This index, which is based on 8 measures up here, one of the most comprehensive and rigorous ones out there, and has 130 indicators of power, is probably one of the best, and it puts the US as the number 1, the most powerful country in Asia, with a score of 81 out of 100, followed closely by China with a score of 74. So China's comprehensive power, if you buy this analysis, is approximating that of the US's, right? Roughly at about 91% of the US. And this index calls these 2 the superpowers of the region. So India, Japan, Russia, Australia, in their 30s, they are way behind the 2 superpowers. Malaysia is at number 10, just below Indonesia and above Thailand. Now, the significance of this index is that is twofold. First, in contrast to what many politicians and analysts claim, Asia today is not multipolar. Asia is very bipolar. Right? You have two major powers, head and shoulders above the rest, in comprehensive power terms, though the United States still remains the region's hegemon. Second, China's overall power still lacks that of the US, but it is closing in. That China's comprehensive power is closing in on the US is what worries the US. US policymakers see it as a strategic or long-term threat. They assume that China will want to displace the US as the leading power in Asia. But the US wants to remain the top dog or the leading power and will do everything it can to prevent China from displacing it. International relations specialists call this the power transition struggle. The rising power, China in this case, will want to challenge the established power, the US, to become the number one. This is the so-called classic logic of international politics, and it is about the contest between the rising and the established power. And in most cases, the issue of who gets to be the top dog is settled by a major war, with World War I, World War II as examples. Those of you who are familiar with Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, 1987, will see him articulate this view very forcefully in his 600-page book. And in recent years, Graham Allison of Harvard University has couched this logic in terms of what he calls the Thucydides trap, where the rise of Athens, read China, and the fear that it caused in Sparta, read the US, trapped the two into an action-reaction cycle that led to the Peloponnesian Wars. Those who believe or subscribe to this competitive dynamic to interpret US-China relations today, and I think you can include me as one of them, we believe that things start to get interesting when the rising power's overall strength approaches 80% of the established powers. You don't wait until parity or 100% before you start to demand changes, right? You start acting naughty at 80% according to the literature. Now this is an approximate threshold, of course, but this is when the politics of power transition is triggered. And according to this index, this threshold has been reached, right? And that, to me, is why we have seen the intensification of US-China rivalry in the last 15 years or so, ever since the Western financial crisis or since Obama's pivot to Asia in about 2011. So it is a bipolar situation where the rising power, conscious of its new club, will demand changes to the existing arrangements and entitlements so that they better reflect its interests. The established power will have to decide whether to concede or to resist. Britain conceded at the turn of the 20th century, and there was a peaceful overtake of it by the US, although there were a lot of squabbles and almost near conflict over Venezuela in the early 20th century between the US and Britain. But in this case, the US is resisting tooth and nail, in my view. We should note, however, that war is not the inevitable outcome. In 12 of the 16 cases that Graham Allison studied, 12 of the cases led to war, 4 did not. So we better hope that the China-US competition will fall into the 25% that did not result in war. So we are talking about decades, right? Not next year or 2027. Now, China, however, denies that it is out to displace the US, saying, for example, that the Pacific Ocean is big enough for two. Graham Allison wasn't too sure what to make of such denials, right? So he sought out and posed the question to Lee Kuan Yew, which many Americans see as Asia's most trenchant observer of China. So Allison asked Mr. Lee, point blank, does China aim to displace the US as the #1 power in Asia or the world? So this is Lee Kuan Yew's reply. Of course, why not? You know, they have transformed a poor society to become an economic miracle, to become the second largest economy in the world. This is about 2012, 2011, when he was interviewed. So the Chinese will want to share this century as co-equals with the US, and it is China's intention to be the greatest power in the world. So this is Lee Kuan Yew's take on China's ultimate strategic intention. So now, Ki Beng is the real China expert here, and I don't know if he agrees, you know, with Mr. Lee on this, on China's grand strategic ambitions. I'm not a China expert, but based on my understanding of international politics, I think Lee Kuan Yew is right. As I suggested earlier, any state with China's size, scale, capabilities, and achievements would aspire to be the hegemon, Beijing's frequent protestations notwithstanding. If Indonesia had China's comprehensive power, it will also want to change or challenge whoever is the top dog. I believe, however, Lee's time frame was probably too cautious. China is unlikely to wait until the end of this century to displace the US. I would settle for 2050, since 2049 is when China's rejuvenation is supposed to be accomplished. So the extreme competition is about being the top dog, because if you are the number one, you get to call the shots, as Ki Beng probably knows. You make the rules of the game, right? Think of the prerogatives that come with having the US dollar as the reserve currency, right? And you have more room to shape the external environment to suit your economic and political interests. In such a competition, each great power will want to get as many countries on its side as it can. A big part about international politics is about winning friends and influencing people, right? And by having them on your side or broadly aligned with your interests, you have a better chance of calling the shots. On the military security side, for example, two of the ASEAN countries, Thailand and the Philippines, are formal treaty allies of the US. Insofar as the US consider such alliances important, it will want to keep them on its side. For China, if it wants to be the predominant power of Asia, it must first and foremost get Southeast Asia to accede to its leadership. Also for the US and China, if you have Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore on your side, your prerogatives in the Straits of Malacca will be more easily exercised. You know, what Iran is doing in the Straits of Hormuz only reinforces, you know, the strategic importance of the Straits of Malacca, which accounts for even more trade in terms of volume. On the economic side, ASEAN is poised to be the fourth largest economy in the world in the mid-2030s, which means that they are just behind the EU. And ASEAN has been the source of many of Asia's regional economic cooperation schemes, such as the TPP and the RCEP, right? So these are the stakes for the US and China. Now, but what about Southeast Asia? Why does it matter who they align with? For some, namely those with alliance treaties or strong security ties with the US, it might mean the difference between security and insecurity. They would like to maintain those ties in the belief that the US military guarantees will deter potential aggressors. Secondly, it might mean the difference between being poor or rich. Those who sided with the US and the West during the Cold War, I would argue, generally prospered because of access to investments and markets in the West. Malaysia, especially Penang, we might say, was an ace beneficiary here. Every trip to and from Bayang Lepas airport, with the Intels, the HPs, the Motorola's, the Bosch, the Infineons, the Ingtec, the Great Tech, dotting the landscape, constitute evidence of the payoffs of Malaysia's alignment with the West. Related to this issue of wealth and prosperity is also the issue of regime survival and political legitimacy of many governments in Southeast Asia. Their legitimacy depends on delivering sustained economic growth, and the leaders who intend to stay in power will need to think where their country's land is going to come from. During the Cold War, it was obvious that the Soviets were no match for the US and the West on the economic provision, but today, however, many believe that China can give the US and the West a run for the money. So it is not surprising that many in Southeast Asia, if they have not chosen, would prefer not to choose because they want to have their cake and eat it too. They look to the US, the faraway power, for security provision, but to China for economic growth, trade and investment. But both China and the US are taking an increasingly dim view of this strategy, as you can see from this quip by He Yafei. It is in Southeast Asia that some of the key or most significant political diplomatic alignments that are up for grabs. Yes, many of them say they want to be friends with both the US and China, but I think we need to probe deeper, go beyond what they say, and look at what they do to ask, even as they are saying those words, of not being aligned, how are they behaving in terms of their policies? So what we did was we came up with 20 indicators across these 5 domains: political, diplomatic, military security, economics, cultural, and signaling, to see who is where over time. Each of these 5 domains are weighted equally in our analysis, and they account for 20% of a country's alignment score. What is distinctive about this alignment index, as we call it, is that we managed to collect data on each of these indicators for over 30 years, from 1995 to 2024. What this longitudinal data allows us to do is to discern the direction of travel over time of each of the countries, right? And this is what we found. This figure is a representation of how the Southeast Asia 10 have positioned themselves if we average out their positions from 1995 to 2024, over 30 years. If you average out where they were each year, this is roughly where they are. The figure to remember is this one, 45 to 55, which we define as being equally aligned or non-aligned, the hedging band, signifying those who are straddling the 2 superpowers, the successful hedges, you may say, who have managed to keep their country at equal strategic distance from the 2 superpowers. So if a country's position is less than 45, we consider it as being more aligned with China. Beyond 55, you are more aligned with the US. So the first thing to note about this figure is that when Southeast Asian countries say they don't want to choose, it doesn't mean that all of them are smack in the middle in this 45 to 55 zone. Now, Thailand, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore are indeed within the hedging range in this particular slice of the data, and suggesting that they are hedging quite nicely if you look at how they position themselves in the last 30 years. But as you can see, the other half of ASEAN are more or less aligned with one or the other superpower. At 62, the Philippines is solidly aligned with the US. Not surprising, right? Whereas Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia are also, quite well aligned with China. Vietnam a bit less so, but still in China's camp, assuming you accept our ban, right? So the conclusion here is that when Southeast Asia, and I think other countries also, say they don't want to choose, it does not mean that they are neutral in their alignment. What they seem to be saying is that they are comfortable where they are, and probably because it has served them well, and would prefer not to move too far from their current position unless circumstances change. Okay, next, let's split the earlier figure you saw into two 15-year time frames, right? Cut the 30-year time frame into two 15-year time frames to get a direction of travel picture. So this figure maps and compares the alignments during these two periods, 95 to 09, 10 to 24. Okay. If you look at the black arrows first, you'll see that the Philippines at 64 and Indonesia at 56 are basically aligned with the US, whereas the ones over here are basically with China. And in the middle is more or less the same group that you saw in the other figure, right? The hedgers or the straddlers, the ones who seem to be doing quite well in balancing their relations between the two giants. Okay, next what I want to do is to show you what happens in the next 15 years. So you look at how the black arrows move, and then with the yellow tags. Okay? So first look at Thailand and Indonesia, TH and ID. So Thailand and Indonesia show the most interesting change. 10 points to the left for Thailand, from 49 to 39. 12 points to the left for Indonesia. A qualitative change in the sense of moving from marginally being in the US camp to being marginally in China's camp. We'll get to the reasons for these movements later. Second, look at the Philippines. 64 to 60. Now, still in the US camp, but this may be reflecting the Duterte years when he was very anti-US and very pro-China. So maybe we did capture the movement. So, but still aligned with the US. Third, have a look at Brunei, Malaysia, and Singapore. Oh, I like that. They also move in China's direction, though not as much as Indonesia, right? Still within the hedging range, you may say. Next, check out Vietnam. Vietnam is the only country to buck the trend, moving from 41 to 45. 41 was with China, 45 means hedging. And next, look at the three Indo-Chinese countries. Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos continue to move leftwards, align strongly with China. Okay, let's do this one more time. Okay, first look at Thailand and Indonesia. Oops. Sorry. Yep. Next, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Brunei, Vietnam, the Indo-Chinese countries. So that's the overall picture. Okay. So if you compare the two time periods, seems to us two observations jump out. First, there's a general leftward shift away from the US in China's direction for virtually all in Southeast Asia. Now, some shifts are major, some shifts are minor, right? The second observation is that in the first period, 95 to 2009, the US and China did not really press the ASEAN countries to take sides because their geopolitical rivalry remained muted at that time. Post the global financial crisis, however, the US-China competition took off in earnest, so that it was during the second period that we saw greater pressure being applied by the US and China on Southeast Asia, and of course others too in other regions, to side with them. The regional perception is that the US pressed harder on Southeast Asia, expressing disappointment, for example, about the region not taking a stronger position on the maritime disputes between the Philippines and China, and on Xinjiang and so on. So much so that at one point, a high-level Singaporean official told the US officials that, please don't force us to choose, because if you do that, you may not like the outcome. So now, the meaning that is a little bit ambiguous, but it doesn't mean that Southeast Asia will choose China, but it's a way of talking to the Americans. Now, China, for its part, accuses the US for its Cold War mentality and for trying to get others to join it in containing China. China's diplomats have said that, you know, but we understand the difficult position you are in, but when it comes time to choose, we are confident that you will be rational. That is, you will go with what they call the wave of the future, namely them. So we summarized, this is a summary of our findings then in terms of who is where. And we also summarized our findings in this Foreign Affairs article published about 6 months ago, published back in July, August 25. Interestingly, Foreign Affairs magazine shied away from publishing the figures I just shared with you. But we love this picture of Southeast Asia sandwiched between you know, two big blue and red magnets, because magnets have become so important in geopolitics today. Oops. Okay, and we have summarized, we have transformed the underlying data in figures 1 and 2 into an interactive website that is meant for you and the global public to check out. And here's the QR code. Please feel free to you know, take it, zap it, because this website allows you to dive deeper into our data, look at the methodology, and look at our empirical claims. And I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to sort of walk you through some of the features. Let me see whether I'll succeed. It says it's better, you know, view on larger screens, which means your laptops and your desktops. Okay, so one of the interesting features about this is, okay, so our indicators are here. If you want to, so we look at UN, United Nations General Assembly voting, partnership levels, and in military security. Our indicators are arms supply, military exercises, and so on. So you get an idea of you know, what we do. And the other thing is, for each of them, if you look at Malaysia, for example, you'll see 3 circles. The more blue means more with the US, more red means more with China. And the innermost circle is 30 years ago, this is 20 years ago, and this is the last 10 years. So Malaysia has moved from 52 to 51 to 46, if you buy our numbers, right? And so if you look at the period here, this is for the 30-year period. And you can change the timing. If you want to just look at the last 20 years, you can do, you can change it. And it gives you a different picture, right? And if you just want to look at the last 10, this is something you can, you know, play around with. The other thing I wanted to share is the weighting. Okay, let's see if I can get to this. All right, now, so we have weighted each of the dimensions 20%, right? You may say that that's not the right way to do it because you believe that economics deserve a much more weighting, right? So you can go to the website and let's say you are really dogmatic on economics and you say you want to weigh economics 100%, right? The most important thing, everything else is 0. Lock it. And it changes. If you just go on economics, then the whole thing becomes very red, right? But let's say you think that in the end it's basically economics and military security. Put this at 100% too.
You've locked it.
Yeah. Wait. Yeah, I have to unlock this. Okay. And then the US predominates, right? So you can. This is you know, a resource for everyone to use, and we hope that you know, you will find this interesting. So see if there's, and then there are other things that you can do. You can compare how different countries, link up with the US or China in terms of their similarities. This is, I think, a comparison of Singapore and Brunei, as to whether they are closer to China or the US. And finally, on these are the individual country scores. And if you want more information about our methodology, our definition, and the limitations, you can go to the information site. Okay, now, let me get out of this. Sorry, yeah. Okay. Now, the index tracks the alignment moves, but it does not explain them. So what explains their alignment moves? Here I draw from the findings of our country experts with a bit of my own ruminations thrown in. The key factors or variables that help us understand their alignments are these four: domestic politics, perceptions of economic opportunities, security ties and estimation of US staying power, and geography. I'll just touch briefly on each of them. Domestic politics. We found domestic politics to be a key factor. There are, however, several ways to think of domestic politics. The one that featured most prominently in the work was of domestic politics conceived in terms of regime legitimation and regime security. By that I mean enhancing the regime's or the government's political legitimacy and hence its survival and longevity. So political legitimacy is obtained on the one hand by consecrating an ideological narrative. We are a democracy, we are a communist country, we are a multinational meritocracy, or we are a national security state, right? And that justifies the regime's rule. And on the other hand, you also get legitimacy by performance, policy performance, such as delivering the expected economic goods or growth. The ability to point to successful polities with similar political complexions is very important for the legitimacy narrative. Cambodia is a case in point. The 1997 coup marked a fundamental decline in US-Cambodian relations and an improvement in Sino-Cambodian relations, because the US denounced Cambodia's human rights practices and provided virtually no foreign investment and no military assistance. And because of this naming and shaming, Washington was viewed as a threat to Hun Sen's government and regime security. Hence, it is not surprising that Cambodia became more strongly aligned with China from the late 1990s. Beijing provided Phnom Penh with significant investments, military assistance, as well as political support, for Hun Sen, unlike the US. Now, as my account of Cambodia's alignment suggests, the regime legitimation and economic opportunity factors are intimately related. As it turns out, perceptions of economic opportunities featured very prominently in all the countries. The standout fact here is that China has replaced the US as the #1 trading partner of virtually everyone in ASEAN except the Philippines. Even in the Philippines, China is #2, right? Consequently, there's a very strong sense of how growing with China serves the national interest, as well as helps secure political legitimacy for the ASEAN states. On the FDI front, China lags behind the US in several countries, but is catching up fast under the Belt and Road Initiative projects. Think of the Chinese-built trains, fast trains from Bangkok to Nong Khai railway lines in Thailand, and Jakarta to Bandung in Indonesia. The case of Indonesia, which surprised I think some of us, combines regime legitimation and economic opportunity in a very interesting way. Our analysis focus on the role of what the author called veto players. Previously, the military was the most significant veto player when it comes to relations with the US and China. That is, if the military says, no, we cannot get too close to China, then the administration will hold back. And because the military is suspicious of China in general and pro-US in particular, given where they were trained and so on. In the post-Suharto years, however, the rise of pro-growth political elites and business groups, and by implication the relative decline of the military, has led to the pro-growth groups becoming the more significant veto player. So these groups tend to see China as an economic opportunity rather than an ideological threat. And that helps explain why Indonesia moved leftward in China's direction. This view of China as an economic opportunity rather than an ideological threat is also Malaysia's view, I believe, beginning with Mahathir. Right? In the case of Indonesia, it is unclear whether the election of Prabowo, former general, may move the needle back in the US direction. We did see some mini steps in that direction recently, such as Indonesia joining Trump's Board of Peace, right? But then Prabowo also made sure that his first state visit was to China. So, third factor, security ties and estimation of US staying power. The two are not the same, but we found it helpful just to put them together, because if you have minimal security ties with the US, you won't worry too much about US staying power, right? The accent, however, is on the staying power of the US. Singapore and Vietnam have been the most explicit in voicing their concerns about US staying power. When Singapore says that the US is a benign hegemon, or that the US forward military presence has been conducive to peace and stability in East Asia, it is not only expressing a deeply held belief, but it is also a speech act that tells the US, please stick around. Right? Finally, geography. The idea here is that your geographic position or location impacts on your alignment choice. If you share a border with China, like Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, with China, atop you, you feel the natural gravitational economic pull of China, though that may be balanced by historical suspicions or animosity, as in the case of Vietnam. Be that as it may, the geographic factor also says, don't piss off your big northern neighbor, right? And that is part of the explanation why Myanmar, Laos, and to some extent Vietnam is still closer to China than the US. That also explains, I think, why Vietnam has been ultra cautious in inching toward the US. Despite US interest in elevating relations to what we call the comprehensive strategic partnership level, Hanoi resisted until 2023, which is 15 years later than they are having such a relationship with China. Despite Vietnam and China having fought a war in 1979. So despite Southeast Asia's apprehensiveness about the intense China-US rivalry and about making the wrong choice, there has been an economic silver lining for some, at least until before Trump 2.0. You've probably seen media declarations about the winner of the US-China trade war since Trump 1.0. Who's the winner? Southeast Asia. Vietnam is often hailed as the chief beneficiary in Southeast Asia of the China plus one strategy, where US and Western multinationals and even Chinese firms are setting up plants outside of China, right, to mitigate the effects of the trade sanctions and to de-risk or render more secure their supply chains. So Apple, Samsung, Intel, Nintendo have all moved some manufacturing to Vietnam. Malaysia has also benefited, with the major semiconductor firms increasing their investments, focusing on packaging, testing, and so on. Singapore gets the higher end technological investments and many of the R&D centers. It is also the preferred regional HQ for many high-tech firms, not to mention family wealth offices, both of which reinforces Singapore's status as a financial hub. However, the situation is changing, with the Trump 2.0 administration seeking to impose high tariffs on transshipment of Chinese goods via countries like Vietnam or Malaysia. So this table summarizes how each of these factors that I just talked about weave themselves in the country chapters of our forthcoming book. So let me conclude then by touching on some of the policy implications of our findings. First, absent from our findings is the position of ASEAN, the regional organization. Because there's no one ASEAN position on the issue. When it comes to their alignment moves, the story is one of a heterogeneity because the interests of the Southeast Asia 10 make it very hard for them to take a common position. So ASEAN is not hanging together on this issue. They may be hanging separately. A second implication is that while the direction of travel is clear, the alignment postures of the key countries are actually quite fluid, in the sense that the actions of China and the US matter. The Israel-Hamas war and staunch US support for Israel, for example, caused significant disaffection of the US among ASEAN countries with significant Muslim population or majorities. The current war in Iran is likely to have similar effects, although the economic hardship that will follow might even be more significant in viewing Trump's USA as a problematic actor in world politics. On the other hand, if China sinks a few Filipino ships in the confrontation in the South China Sea, it may also cause the hedges to reconsider their positions. Finally, changes in the leadership of the ASEAN countries, of course, also matter. Right? I mean, witness, for example, how Marcos Jr. has shifted strongly away from China back to the US after the Duterte. Third implication, not all of the Southeast Asia states strategize or calibrate their alignment moves in the way that Singapore, Malaysia, or Vietnam seem to do. The writer of our Indonesia chapter argued, for example, that Indonesia may be sleepwalking into China's camp, by which he meant Indonesia's direction of travel is not a result of careful deliberation and calculation by the national government. It is more the result of uncoordinated actions and policies by private economic actors, the foreign ministry, and so on. For countries like Myanmar, Laos, geography and regime type impose severe constraints on how far they can distance themselves from China. And at the other end of the spectrum, the Philippine deep state is congenitally attached to the US. Last but not least, our findings are based on data to late 2024. So, meaning that they do not incorporate the actions and policies of Trump 2.0. Now, by upending the assumptions underlying much of Southeast Asia's path to economic growth and prosperity, and by inflicting punishing tariffs on many in the region, the US is coming across as less benign, less reliable, more coercive, and very revisionist. Singapore has become much more vocal about how the US is becoming what it calls a rent seeker, taking a narrower conception of its interests and more coercive. Vietnam, the one country in our index that moved toward the US, is slapped with 20% tariffs, right, initially, in the liberation tariffs, and for transshipment ones, 40%. Indonesia has joined the BRICS, among whose agenda is to defend against US weaponizing the dollar and SWIFT. And Trump has threatened 100% tariffs on those who join BRICS, while Vietnam and Malaysia have been granted partner status in the BRICS. Now, Anwar was very well liked in the past by the US. These days, however, his criticisms of the US support for Israel in Gaza and the war in Iran, combined with Malaysia's engagement with China and the BRICS, suggests that when we update the developments of 2025 for our index, we might see Malaysia inching away, from 47 in China's direction. Now, whether it will tip over from hedging to something else, I think that will be interesting to see. So here's the parting thought. Is Southeast Asia's, might Southeast Asia be the canary in the mine? That is what we are seeing happening here in terms of the alignment movements. Are they a harbinger of things to come for the global South, including countries in Latin America and Africa? I'll leave that for you to ponder. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a lot to take in. So I'll understand if no hand goes up immediately. Well, of course, I have the prerogative to ask the first question, and in a way, I have a lot of half questions really in my head. But I'll just try to keep to one or two points to make before I open the floor to all of you. The first, of course, is what you said at the end, that all of this was done before the Iran war. And even before Britain and so on.
Yeah.
And I think I'm sure in most of our heads today we're wondering, okay, this is fine until last year. What's happened since then? But I know it's not a fair question.
No,
I wonder if you have some thoughts about that. That's my first question. The second one is, when we think of the Thucydides trap of number one fighting number two fighting number one, but we also see that the power of one or two is not only in themselves, but in their soft power and in their alliances. Mm-hmm. So I assume at some point, when you reach, say, when you said 80%, you reach 80% of number one, the battle will change in that you're not going to count GDP to GDP or whatever, you're going to count like BRICS.
Yeah.
You start affecting the alliances, because the alliances is what supports the 100%. And perhaps one could see that what Trump seems to be doing with the Iran war and Britain is to undermine himself. So he's starting to give up the 20% that China is trying to catch up on. Just two thoughts that occurred to me. Any comments on that way of thinking?
Of course, on the first point about what about 2025, right? If you think of the Liberation Day, Liberation tariffs, and if you look at U.S. Starting the war against Iran together with Israel, I think you will probably, if you were to guess how it will affect reaction from the global South, including ASEAN, it would be that when we update the data, we are likely to see more movement in China's direction. China is, of course, doesn't need to do very much and let the US make the mistakes that it is making and can reap the benefits just by sitting tight. So in that sense, we expect when we update the data on the index to see even greater movement to the left. Now, whether who will tip over to be aligned with China, that's a different question. But the direction of movement, I think, will be reinforced by events since Trump came to office. And I can talk a little bit more about Trump and Iran and the implications, the economic and the strategic implications later, in case there are other questions. But don't let me get away with that. I do have some thoughts on that. And on your question, Kibing, on alliances, that's a very good question. Alliances on two fronts. One is that I think our data underestimates U.S. influence and power projection. Consistent with what you just suggested, because we have looked at things in a very binary way, just China and U.S., but we haven't been able to factor in the U.S. also works with Australia, South Korea, Japan, a series of very strong alliances in a way that allows it to project its power and make it a very important strategic player. Even if it's not going to play, even if it decides not to play as active a role in East Asia in the years ahead. And if you combine India into the picture, So the US power projection and power residuals is pretty big. It's not captured by our movement of but what I think is also worthwhile to think about is that China is also racking up a lot of, let's say, strategic partners, right? So in that sense, BRICS, you know, and all the schemes that China has come up with also reinforces its soft and institutional power. One of the things that I did not get to share with you is that if you think about people joining, one of our indicators of alignment is you join the multilateral institutions, you know, that either the US or China, you know, initiates, but without the US or China. So if you join something like the BRI, right, it's an indication of your willingness to be, you know, friendly and close to China, participate in its economic projects. After all, the US asked the Obama administration asked the UK not to join the AIIB. Those of you familiar with the AIIB, right? But David Cameron said, no, we are joining. And once Britain joined the AIIB, the rest of Europe followed. And the reason why the US did not want Britain to join the AIIB, according to Obama, was because the US wants to continue to set the rules of the international economic game. Doesn't want China to set it. All right. But the UK was, you know, disregarded that and joined and got a position. UK was the vice president, you know, in the inaugural AIIB. So, all right. But what is interesting then is if you look at the institutional efforts of the US and China in the last 20 to 30 years, you will find that who has been coming up with the menu, that's the way we put it, all right, for countries in Southeast Asia and beyond to choose, right? And I think the answer is very clearly China. China has been coming up with one initiative after another for people to choose. BRI, AIIB, you know, Greater Civilization Discourse, you know, Development Initiative, tons, many of them. So for each one, the Southeast Asians will have to decide whether to, you know, join. The US has come up with how many? One. TPP. Now TPP was originally, in a sense, ASEAN thing with Singapore, Brunei, Chile, New Zealand coming up, you know, with that. And then it was hijacked by the Obama administration and aborted by the Trump administration on the first day in office. So the one significant regional economic institution that the US wanted to advance, all right, did not occur, at least you know, with the Trump administration. So in terms of institutions for people to join, all right, in the East Asia arena, it's clear that, you know, China is the chief chef cooking up, you know, all the initiatives. And in that sense, the US lacks.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, I'll open to the floor. We have about half an hour. The hand, sir, you can go first.
First, good idea, yeah. First, thank you so much for this multi-discipline, I can't think of the word, analysis of the economic, military, and all these things for us to be able to look at things. We tend to look at things rather narrowly. And I really appreciate your point 4, that the information that we've gotten is from before the Trump 2.0. My question is, in light of what's happening, would I be wrong in saying that we are in the midst of World War III?
Shall we take 2 or 3
sure.
questions? There was a hand in the back? Yeah, I have. Didn't recognize him.
Hi there. Thank you. Yeah, this is a question as well, because like, I think if I read it correctly, is that you talk about multilateralism. How about global naturalism? I think that's one thing that has been in our mind. Sorry. Now, I mean, since you mentioned a lot about multilateralism, right? I think you were responding to his question earlier, just now. So I just want to know, what's your take on plurilateralism? Since I think that's the hot take right now, that people are focusing more on sectorial partnership. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I noticed in your alignment index, you have included about signaling. So how do you actually measure positive signaling with negative signaling? I think that's a very interesting part, because that involves a lot of language. And I think in diplomacy, language is an important signal. So how do you classify those sort of things? I'll just ask these two questions first. Thank you.
Thank you.
One more then, yeah? Later, please. Yeah, Maui, please.
Two quick questions, Khong. First is, in your construction of the power index, how many percent is soft and hard power?
Sorry, how many percent is soft power?
And versus hard.
Okay.
And second one is, since we're talking about the rivalry between two hegemons, do you subscribe or share more John Mearsheimer's view on China, or Jeffrey Sachs, which relates then to the whole question, or even if it's John's view that there must be one hegemon, or Lee Kuan Yew's, then even if China becomes a hegemon, I think the type of hegemon is different. Based on the historical record of China, which was the hegemon for centuries.
Yes.
Right? It may not be the type of destructive hegemony that you see. And finally, this whole question, if it is John's view, then there is no room for multipolarity. It's only hegemony, period.
Okay. Thank you for those very chim questions. Okay. All right. I think the first question on World War III does, in a sense, relate to Mahui's question about Mearsheimer multipolarity. And I'll try to combine the two. World War III. Okay. Let me see. How should I tackle this? I think my own view is that we are not there yet. Those of now, I had earlier claimed that the situation is bipolar. Okay. International relations specialists who study bipolarity, they tend to like it. They celebrate it because when we look at bipolarity during the Cold War with the US and the Soviet Union, we saw that as a period of general systemic stability. Some historians have called that period the long peace, right? No central war between Europe and in the Central Theater. Now, those of us in Asia may beg to differ because we had the Korean War and the Vietnam War, right? But in the overall scheme of things, international relations specialists see it as limited wars in Asia. The system held, in other words. So bipolarity is good. Multipolarity is bad. Because under multipolarity, the first half of the 20th century, you have World War I, you have World War II. So the correlation between multipolarity and world wars suggests that multipolar situations are actually less stable than bipolar situations. Now, if you buy that argument, then you can say that despite the competition between the US and China, the US has identified China as the pure challenger, no doubt about that, right? And you can say that what it wants to do in Greenland, what it is doing in Venezuela, all ultimately, China may be in its crosshairs. So in that sense, the competition will get more intense, but because they are both nuclear armed powers, we expect nuclear deterrence to hold, and we expect them to reach back from the brink if they ever come to that. But the competition will be severe, it will be intense. Some people say just let the best person win this competition. The power that can manage to convince the rest of the world to accept its leadership, right? Others feel that America, by virtue of its ideology or what deserves to be the winner, my conservative American friends will just refuse to believe or think of a world in which America is not the number one, right? Now that is, in a sense, a dangerous way of thinking. But given the bipolar situation, so some of us are quite reassured that it's unlikely to happen. But if there is a military crisis in Taiwan, right, then I think it becomes much harder to predict, because Taiwan is a sort of existential issue for China, right? And I think that would be one of the most dangerous situations. But even then, I think both sides will be very careful. My own view is that despite what some US generals say, China need not rush, to use force on Taiwan in 2025, 26, 27. Those were some of the years mentioned. I don't think it's going to happen. So I'm a little bit more optimistic. I don't think World War III is the current scenario for World War III is one of inadvertent sleepwalking into a world war. Both sides do not want it. All right, but because of a series of mistakes or misperceptions, they might end up doing that. So it's very, very important that we have guardrails, that we have confidence-building mechanisms, and so on between the two superpowers. And okay, plural multilateralism. Very, very good point. You are right. I think both on the part of the US and on the part of many countries in Southeast Asia, plural multilateralism is the way to go. If you have read Mark Carney's wonderful speech at Davos, right, that is, I think, the direction of travel. The like-minded, coming together to do what they can in order to beef up, let's say, the WTO, the arbitration process, things of that sort. And Singapore is very active in that. One scheme after another in order to mend the parts of the international economic system that is broken. So I see a lot of initiatives in that. I think absolutely that's the way. CPTPP would be a prime example, and Japan stepping up to the to the role, which is quite unusual, because Japan has been taking a very low profile, until recently, until CPTPP. So I think all this will be helpful, and it's also helpful in the sense that it suggests that for a US that is disillusioned with the liberal international economic order that it used to champion, right? Others, who still like the system can get together to repair, the parts of it that are helpful to them. And the US can decide to join later if it wants. But of course, the US is doing things on its own side, right? Like the Quad, like the AUKUS, on the strategic front, because they feel that, they need to do something, they need to deal with China, principally. And on Mahui's question on soft power index, okay, so the soft power, we have one dimension, 20%, right? So soft power is one domain. Military security is another domain. So this is the military side, this is the soft power cultural side, and then we have political, diplomatic, how many heads of states meetings you have. Then we have economics and trade, and then signaling. Right? And now come to signaling, I need to answer your question about signaling. So we think this is a comprehensive way to go about it. When we started the project, we came up with 80 indicators instead of 20. But over time, we winnowed it down to 20 that we thought were most significant. And on the question of signaling, positives and negative signals, we actually basically piggyback on what we call the IQ data, ICEW, put out by the Harvard think tank, Harvard Center in Harvard, where they quote all media mentions of, we disagree with you on that, or we agree with you on that. And so they combine all those data, and then they see how many of them are from, let's say, Singapore to the US, or US to Singapore. So it's a database that wasn't created by us, but which we piggyback on. And okay. Am I close? Mami, your question is, am I closer to Mearsheimer or?
Jeffrey Sachs.
Jeffrey Sachs. Okay. what is Sachs's argument?
Sachs is that China is not going to seek to be a hegemon.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Then I'm with China. Okay. That's because as I mentioned, for those of us who have read Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, Rise and Decline of Great Powers, his classic 1987 book, if you believe his history, and he basically looks at 500 years of European history and say, the rise of one power, and how it stays at the top for a while, and then there's imperial overstretch, and then some challenger will come up. This cycle of international politics recurs again and again, right? And those who argue about the Thucydides trap also basically sees this logic, and in that sense, I'm a believer in that logic. Whereas the notion that China, now then we have on the notion of whether China wants to be a hegemon. I look at all the things China has done in the last 15 years. It seems to me that they are consistent with what someone who wants to be the number one power should do. All right, setting up the AIIB, the New Development Bank, BRICS, BRI. All these schemes are to sort of put China in a position, all right, where it can use in order to consolidate its leadership when the time comes. Now, the thing is that this trajectory is not something that will happen in 10, 15 years. We are talking about many decades, right? And so my understanding of international politics is that this is natural. And that's why I say that if Indonesia had the same comprehensive power, it will also want to challenge the US to be the top dog of the region. So based on what I see China has been doing, my take is that it will want to be the hegemon, and that's quite natural and understandable.
It's normal development.
Yeah, and on technology too. But those intentions things are very now. But the fact that China wants to be the hegemon doesn't mean that we are destined for war, as the title of Graham Allison's book says.
So what it would mean when they become stronger and are above 80.
Yeah.
They become stronger military. The
Yeah.
military spending is still below US.
Yes.
My question was they could do the same what US does with Venezuela and Cuba.
Yeah.
They could also put much more military influence on ASEAN
Yeah.
to align them.
Yeah.
Help them to align faster to China. I
Yeah.
don't see it now, but it could 20, 30 years
Yeah,
ago.
and that's what we in IR call bandwagoning. Right? You decide, which power you side with based on your analysis of, how much help they can give you. And sometimes, even if you distrust them, you think that you should bandwagon with them because they will hurt you less if you do that, right? And then, Mark, back to your question about, hey, if you look at the Chinese tributary system, when China was the hub of the tributary system, actually the East Asian world was very peaceful. That's actually a very relevant point, right? And but for those who believe in the American tributary system, I have written an article that said that the U.S. From 1900 to 10 years ago was the hub of a U.S. tributary system, much like China's. Although it was more violent, the buy-in into the U.S. tributary system was immense. Europe, Southeast Asia, Middle East. In other words, when we think of the liberal, US-led liberal economic order or US-led liberal international order, it was one that was remarkably successful. And partly because the US, although was willing to use force when necessary, was also willing to, in a sense, help others, to achieve their potential. So it was, there are. We all have issues, it was inconsistent in its application of, the principles and so on. But by and large, I think those who bought into the US system did quite well. Right? So in that sense, the US system was also a beneficial one to many around the world. But of course, the interesting thing about the US system is that it is now the US who is sort of getting out of it. because the results of globalization has been such that a large segment of the American population has not benefited, right? They feel that they have been let down, right? And Trump represents that voice, right? And according to Michael Sandel, they feel that they have been looked down upon within their own country, right? And they needed someone who can express that dissatisfaction, of why they are at where they are.
Thank you. We have time for another round. Yeah.
No, very short question on top. It looks that China will be the new superpower in 10 or 20 or 30 years, seeing all these factors. What about aging population? And when I compare China with India, of course there are different developments, but I think this could also stop the whole thing, what you presented about China.
There is criticism or even perception that China hasn't been very interventionist to support their allies like Iran and Venezuela. Are they trying to avoid the confrontation and trying to be overt or being covert, or are they not doing anything at all?
Yeah, Dr. Khong, I think there's something you're trying to get off your chest, so hopefully my question will allow you to do that. Should the GCC, the Gulf states, be the canary in the mine and not ASEAN? And do you think that canary will survive?
Okay. Any last question we could put in for this last one? Okay.
I'm thinking about the future, and one of the ideas is that the United Nations should move out of the United States, and that actually the best destination for them is ASEAN, and Singapore and Thailand are among the best places for this. Yeah, that's.
Okay, thank you. One more? Oh, okay.
Yeah, short one. There is a short one. I just want to know about the ASEAN factor in this whole argument, because I think when we look into all these arguments, it was kind of like, a more linear point of view. But how about if it's clustered together? Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't get the question. Can you just
I just want to know how does the ASEAN factor actually plays in a role in this argument. So perhaps you can elaborate on that. Thank you.
You mean on the alignments?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Right.
So we're looking more on the cluster role. Yeah.
Okay. The relevance of ASEAN. Really.
Okay. I'm afraid on the issue of how one should align with the US and China, there is no cluster role. Each ASEAN country is out for itself, depending on their geography, depending on their history, and the amount of investment they're getting from the US and China. So it's in a sense, they cannot hang together on this particular, because ASEAN if you look at ASEAN documents, they'll say that we prefer not to choose. And that's why, okay, fine, if you say you don't want to choose, then we really want to break it down to the individual countries to see what each of them have done, right? And it is true that there is a group in the middle that are still hedging, right? But then the majority, it seems to me, have taken up a position, and it's going to be very, very hard for them to come to a common position on these strategic choices. Now, on some other issues, like coming up with new initiatives for economic cooperation, I think there's still a role for ASEAN, because ASEAN likes to talk about wanting centrality, what we call ASEAN centrality, right? ASEAN centrality on the military strategic issues, I think is going to be very much more challenging in the coming years, and in fact in the last 10 years, with the advent of AUKUS, with the advent of the Quad, right? But on economic matters, if you think about RCEP and so on, I think there's still a role for ASEAN initiatives, and quite promising. I think ASEAN can do things, green technology, green digital technology, things of that sort. So, future, move the UN out of the US. Yes, I think, that might be something to think about, but I think it'll be tough, partly because despite all the advantages of the UN being in a more neutral place, like let's say KL or Singapore, the P5 will have none of it. I think that that is very clear. And you don't need the P5. Even one of them, the US says no, and that won't be happening. So it's something that is harder to pursue. But I think more promising might be the changes in the Security Council. Inducting India, Brazil, Japan. That may have more sort of legs to travel. GCC, canary in the mine. I'm not sure about that. I thought, given what is happening in the Gulf right now, the GCC would be more convinced about the necessity of sticking with America, right? Despite they are getting a lot of missiles, and drones from Iran, right? But they have been holding back from retaliating, counting on the US. So it shows the continued importance of the US to their strategic survival, right? And they will have to think about what to do with Iran. So I don't think they will move away from the US. It shows them that they still need the US very greatly. Confrontation. Aging population, yes. The demographic transition is a very major issue in China, whereas India has a much younger population, average age of 29, China is 41, something like that. So, and because of that, having to support an older workforce and not having enough, people in the workforce, that will constrain, I think, China's ability to, produce the economic goods with the economic efficiency that may be needed for China to displace the US. So, I mean, in the past, we have talked about China overtaking the US as the biggest economy by 2030, right? I think these days it has been postponed at least by 5 years, right? Not only because of the demographics, but also because of the real estate bubble that has bursted and the economic stagflation in China. So I think it will take a much longer time. But I think the ambition and the basics that China has in terms of the military, anti-ship ballistic missiles technology, puts China in a position where it still has what it takes, to sort of challenge America. And the US is doing everything it can to make sure that, China does not do that successfully. On that note, I think...
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well,
sorry, your question was about interventionist.
Iran and Venezuela are their allies. They're not in.
Oh yeah. Why China hasn't done anything? Okay, all right. I think China has kept a very low profile on this, partly because I don't think there's that much China can do, despite all these things happening that will affect actually negatively on its interest. Whether it's oil or a strong ally like Iran. So China may also be eyeing the May meeting between Trump and China, where they can deal with the bigger issues. All right. So in that sense, not supporting Iran and Venezuela, and they're so far away. It's it's quite typical of super big powers not responding, to however strong, to middle powers that it might have had a strong relationship with, but and just keep a low profile and let the US make the mistakes, in for example Iran, get into a quagmire and then reap, the benefits. I think China is probably better off keeping a low profile, and when the whole thing is over, if you come on top as the more restrained, more responsible power, then your claim for regional leadership will become more credible.
Thank you. Just about time. Thank you for so good to ask them.
Thanks very much.
Hope you come back again.
Thank you. All right. It's a pleasure.
Thank you everyone for coming. I hear that Professor Khong has a new project that lasts 5 years, so he's bound to be back every other year at least. Thank you.
Yeah.